Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, March 28th, 1839, an investigation begins into the death of a woman named Mira. Mira was enslaved on the North Carolina farm of a 57-year-old named John Hoover. Mira's body was dug up and a local coroner looked for signs of mistreatment and foul play in her death. And soon thereafter, Hoover was arrested in the death of Mira, accused of torturing and then murdering the woman. He went to trial, he was convicted, and he was executed for his actions. So, suffice it to say that enslavers being held legally accountable for the treatment of their slaves is very, very rare, and suffice it to say it gets into all sorts of convoluted legal and moral questions about how a system can both uphold slavery and then try in a moment like this to draw a line about what kind of abuse goes too far. So a really fascinating, wrenching moment. Let's talk about the death of Mira, the trial of John Hoover, and more. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Kellie, this is, your territory. You write about violence, especially in pre-Civil War South, or especially in the South, racial violence. Did you know about this story or even these instances of quote-unquote accountability?
Which is interesting because normally I'm looking at violence that Black people are committing against slaveholders. But in this case, it was not something that I saw come across abolitionist newspapers, which is a little shocking because I would have thought this is sort of the perfect story to use as a defense or as a weapon against the institution of slavery, to talk about why it should be dismantled, because look how violent it is. People are being killed and there are no consequences or repercussions for the violent and barbaric acts of slaveholders. This does get taken up in the abolitionist movement a little bit later with Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which becomes a famous best-selling novel. There's
a sort of name check of this moment.
Yes,
in there, right?
Yes, absolutely. But in its time,
it didn't.
Yeah, in its time, not a lot of traction.
Yeah, wow.
And it's interesting, Kellie, when you say that, because in a way, it maybe doesn't have the same power for an abolitionist movement to say, okay, this enslaver killed a woman he enslaved and was held accountable for it. And that because there are plenty of enslaved people who are killed by their enslavers and there's no accountability, which is probably a more useful set of stories.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think all of this leads me to believe, though, too, that I think two things are probably happening. Mira was probably much more valued in her community than people recognized. I think the fact that a coroner went to dig her body up says something, the reason behind that. Did someone, tip him off? Did someone say, oh, did you know she died? Did you know how she died? The way in which I think people respond to her death, or how people responded to her death, I think is telling. And then I think also how people thought of Hoover is also telling as well. If they saw him as a menace to society, if he was a brute, if he owed people money, people had grievances. I mean, there's a lot of reason to go after someone as well.
Yeah, that idea there were grievances against him, that he was disliked, definitely. Even though we don't have that information in the historical record, it feels like that's almost certainly the case, that there had to be animus against him for him to be held responsible.
Yeah, and such a good reminder that often the particular dynamics, sociological dynamics on the ground in the community are often the sort of explanation for why something plays out the way it does. That said, obviously this story brings up so many other interesting questions that we'll get to. Let's start, though, with the particulars of the case. Some of these details are really brutal, but, as Kellie reminds us, this is brutal. There's no sanitizing this. No. But, the medical examiner does dig up Mira's body, finds that she had suffered 5 wounds to the head. There's a quote that from the back of her head to her heels was literally a continued wound. Apparently, on the day she died, Hoover had chained her to a log in the yard by her neck. The court records state that around sundown, she attempted to stand up to head back towards the house, but fell down and then never recovered and died right there on that spot. Not much else is known about Mira or why Hoover might have treated her so horribly, but Kellie, I think you're right to point out that there were probably an understanding within the community of the dynamic between those two and him and, but Tell us a little bit about what happens when this goes to trial, where we do have a little bit more of a record of how it gets played out and how this gets argued. Hoover's accused of murder. What is his defense?
Well, I mean, the trial itself, shockingly, all happens pretty quickly. I mean, all of this takes place within a matter of days. Really, the trial takes place just on one day. But Hoover's argument is, it's my right. It's my property. I can do whatever I want with my property. If I want to dispose of my property, that is my right. And in some ways, he's not wrong. I mean, when you think about slavery as an institution, that is how a lot of slaveholders operated, with the idea that you are property, you are not a person. And if I dispose of you, if I harm you, if I violate you, well, it is no more than damaging, an animal or a tool, or any other sort of like object that people would use for their own profit or benefit. And there are a lot of instances in which enslaved people are also killed as a result of slavery, and there are no consequences. No one is sort of following up, which is why I think the context or the unknown context around this is really important. But the wild thing about this is that the community really sort of gets behind, maybe not Mira per se, but the idea that this has gone just a little too far. And they not only convict him of being guilty of murder, but they move to execute him as a result of it.
And this ultimately is a case, again, like I do think the quickness in which this was decided suggests that this was seen as a real crime in the community. But the appeal then goes to North Carolina's Supreme Court Justice Thomas Ruffin. And given Ruffin's background, you might have anticipated that the verdict and the sentence would have been overturned, because Ruffin was the author of a decision called State v. Mann, in which he had said essentially that the slave owner has an absolute power over the enslaved. He writes in the decision, "The slave, to remain a slave, must be made sensible that there is no appeal from his master," right? That you are under the complete control of the person who has enslaved you. And this is something that there was national outcry. This was something that the abolitionist movement responded to pretty thoroughly, because they're like, this is the rot at the core of the system of slavery, is this absolute power over another human being. But when Ruffin gets this case, even he says, this is too far. That absolute authority does not extend to murder. And he upholds the conviction.
Worth also pointing out that Ruffin himself was a slave owner, had 30 slaves who had tried to run away, had tried to burn down his house. I don't think his reputation was very sterling.
It's not
and
great.
so, it's kind of remarkable. And this case, State v. Mann, does get, as you said, national attention, and it appears in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes about it. But then in this next ruling, we get this... we get this idea where Ruffin, maybe surprisingly, says, quote, "The master's authority is not altogether unlimited. He must not kill. There is at the least this restriction upon his power. He must stop short of taking life." Before we get to, and I'm sure we all have lots of thoughts about kind of that logic and what that says and what it sort of, I think the sort of illogic of slavery that it points out, I do want to say that there are kind of attempts throughout this era to codify this question. And there are laws on the books throughout, starting in the 13 colonies and then throughout the states, that kind of try and hone in on this question of whether it is legal or lawful to kill a slave. And there are no laws that explicitly state that killing a slave is lawful. But like, for instance, the state of Mississippi has a law in the books in the 1850s that says that it is not a crime to kill an enslaved person, quote, "by accident or misfortune in lawfully correcting a child or servant, or by accident or misfortune in the heat and passion upon any sudden and sufficient provocation." So, very expansive language there about where it is allowed to kill someone. And there are a lot of laws sort of around that.
Because all you'd have to say is it was an accident, or I lost my temper.
Which is what Hoover's defense kind of is in this situation. And I think it says, like, again, as we're saying, it probably says a lot about his particular standing in that community, that argument doesn't win over in that moment.
It's a high-stakes election year, so it's not enough to just follow along. You need to understand what's happening so you are fully informed come November. Every weekday on the NPR Politics Podcast, our political reporters break down important stories and backstories from the campaign trail so you understand why it matters to you. Listen to the NPR Politics Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, there's a note at the trial. You have witnesses who come forward who testify to Hoover brutally torturing Mira for months before her murder. And I think that sort of points to a kind of sadism. Like, this isn't the heat of the moment. This is somebody who you tortured and murdered in a very deliberate way. And so it's like that tiny little carve out for the kind of murder that a person can actually be convicted for.
Yeah. But it's also interesting, too, because even for slaveholders that kill their enslaved property, there are still not meaningful consequences for when that happens. So the idea that you would get the death penalty, in this case, I think is what makes it exceptional, because most slaveholders might have to pay a fine, or they might sort of be like socially, shunned, but there's no meaningful consequence that would happen outside of paying a fine and being out the cost of your enslaved person.
I think that's right. I mean, you can have the laws on the books as convoluted as they are, and then it's just about whether they actually get enforced. And, for instance, in Alabama in 1837, a slave owner is accused of whipping a slave boy to death, and he's found guilty of manslaughter. But to your point, 2 months in prison and a fine of $500, right? No real enforcement there. So it is this really does stand out, I think, because of not just the accusation, but actually the sort of follow through on the penalty.
Yeah. And the converse is that enslaved people could not defend themselves. So there's like the famous case of Celia versus Missouri, where her enslaver tries to sexually assault her and she kills him. And she says, I was defending myself from sexual assault. And the Missouri law basically says, no, Black women are not considered rapeable. Like, he was well within his right to be able to do that. And they executed her for using self-defense. I mean, they took self-defense completely off the table. You're not entitled to defend yourself as enslaved property. Which gives you, obviously, this is why slavery is so evil, is that there's no way to sort of address any grievance if you are enslaved.
Right. Because the ability to address a grievance is a fundamental right. And
yes.
one of the many fundamental rights that aren't extended to enslaved people.
And would have to recognize your personhood, which is something that slavery was not about doing either.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's where I kind of want to get your thoughts. I mean, this is, I think, I'm sure listeners are hearing this. This is my reaction to this too, but this seems like another story, and basically every story about slavery does this, but, this seems like another story that kind of points out the sort of deep illogic and cruelty around the idea of trying to sort of set up laws and systems and logic around something that is at its heart just immoral and barbaric. But this case does bring that up. How can you sort of have these ideas about taking away someone's freedom or crossing over into the line of barbarism within a system that is entirely predicated on denying someone's freedom and on enforcing a code through violence? I think we did an episode recently about, what was it, New Jersey, that had that law about the sort of quote unquote gradual emancipation. And it's like, well, as soon as you start to try and write laws and use specific language that draw lines, it just shows you how absurd this whole project is.
Yeah, because you can't make slavery honorable, right? You can't have like respectable politics in slavery. None of it makes sense. And at the same time, I mean, you had people who truly believed that slavery was a civilizing institution.
Right.
That it brought Black people civilization. And that, there's a lot of square pegs that you are just not going to fit in these round holes because they don't make sense. And they're actually not intended to make sense either. They're intended to maintain power structures. And I think that's what's like at the heart of it. This is actually not about logic, but it's about power.
Kellie, your point there about slavery being a civilizing institution, I think there's also, correct me if I'm wrong, but also this idea that, enslavers too, that like there's an honorable way to be an enslaver, right? To be a master.
Oh yeah.
And that maybe here Hoover sort of crossed that line into barbarism. But that, you can actually be civil on the enslaver side as well.
Part of the narrative, I think, of slavery is perpetuating the idea of good masters, kind masters. Because if you can accept that someone can be kind and good, then you've already legitimized the system that needs to be in play. So you don't question whether or not you should be a slaveholder. You question, do you want to be good or bad as a slaveholder? And then that becomes the new framework for how people operate.
And to be a lawful slaveholder, right? That by constructing a tissue-thin limit, by constructing a set of laws and rules and regulations around slavery, the idea is that it's rationalizing it and also like naturalizing it into the law itself. And when you have that ability for white people to appeal to those laws, then it does create a space for these are the people who lawfully enslave others, and these are the people who do it unlawfully. And when we punish the unlawful ones, then we help to shore up the institution of lawful slavery.
Yeah. But I don't think anyone's looking at Hoover and saying necessarily, "Oh, I don't want to be him." I think they're saying, "Oh, I don't want to be caught."
Right.
Like, because the same thing is happening everywhere. It's, well, Hoover messed up because he got caught, or he went too far,
or he had enemies for other reasons,
or he wasn't liked,
or he had enemies, he wasn't liked. And maybe, my next question is, okay, if he gets executed, who gets his property? Who gets his land? Does he have a wife? Does he have children? Who is benefiting from his death?
Yeah. Well, on that point, a little coda to this whole story as we wrap up. But 4 of Hoover's sons would fight in the Civil War. 2 died in the Civil War. And then this Thomas Ruffin, who, issues these 2 rulings that are sort of relevant to all of this. But he has, maybe this won't surprise us, he has a statue outside of the State Court of Appeals, but that statue does come down in 2021. So there you go. All right. Well, let's leave it there. Really fascinating story, if a sort of hard one to work through, but I'm glad we did it. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia. From